we will go ahead and get started, and I'll go ahead and start off with our introduction. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sean Martin, the Donald and Lauren Morel Associate Professor of Business Administration at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business. Dr. Martin is a distinguished scholar and educator, renowned for his expertise in leadership, organizational behavior, and social class differences. His research delves into how social class shapes people's experiences and behaviors in the workplace. One of the key aspects of his work is exploring how transitions between social class can develop unique skills and abilities that are valuable both organizationally and socially. Dr. Martin emphasizes the importance of recognizing and leveraging the diverse talents that people from different social backgrounds bring to organizations. He believes that leaders at all levels can facilitate opportunities for those from below the federal poverty line backgrounds, helping to realize the talents they carry with them. Dr. Martin's research focuses on how social class shapes leadership and work, exploring the unique skills and abilities that individuals can bring to organizations. His work has been widely published in top academic journals and has garnered significant attention for its insights into how leaders can create inclusive environments that leverage the diverse talents of their teams. His work has been featured in various popular outlets such as the New York Times, Washington Post, CNBC, Forbes, Fast Company Incorporated, Time Magazine, Harvard Business Review, and the Boston Globe. Did I have to do all those for this? Yes. Dr. Martin also researches topics related to principle, leadership, employee voice, social class differences, organizational culture, communication, employee integration, and motivation. At Darden, Dr. Martin teaches leadership and leadership development in both the residential and executive MBA programs, as well as numerous executive education programs. He is highly regarded for his ability to connect with students and executives alike, providing them with practical tools and strategies to enhance their leadership capabilities. In addition to his academic achievements, Dr. Martin regularly collaborates with executives, managers, and frontline employees across various industries, including government organizations, creative firms, tech and IT firms, manufacturing, insurance organizations, financial institutions, and labor services. His work speaks to his history growing up on the West Coast, listening to Wu-Tang Clan, enjoying tacos any day of the week, and living by the belief that we find our greatest strength in our vulnerability. You can find Sean in his suits and scoots attire around North Grounds, and we are honored to have him with us today to share his valuable insights and experience. Please join me in welcoming him for an engaging and thought-provoking discussion.
Well, I mean, that was very generous. Thank you. I don't have anything else to say, everybody. Let's go home. That was it. No, I mean, I can. With the problem with having such a wonderful introduction is I can only disappoint, and I will try my best not to. But wow, thank you very much. It's a joy to be here. I leapt at this opportunity to be able to speak to this audience and this group because the topic is something I very much care about, and I think it's something that culturally we care very much about in the UVA community, which is understanding how we're shaped essentially by the backgrounds that we grow up in and our transitions to go from positions of higher privilege or lower privilege to be upwardly mobile, downwardly mobile, and we want to be the kind of institution that facilitates upward mobility and helps people do better. It helps people improve their lives, and certainly that's an aspiration that's shared by lots of different organizations as well as countries. So that's why this is such an important topic to me, and I look forward to sharing some of it with you. I'm going to start off with just a really quick introduction of what I mean when I'm talking about social class, because it's not something we talk about a lot, generally speaking, at least in my experience. So when we talk about social class and what we mean by it, it's a person's position of advantage or disadvantage to the people around them in terms of access to resources, basically. And the way that we measure it when we're doing empirical kinds of studies is considering it as some combination of income, which is obviously a very important resource around, I can buy the things that I need to make things happen in my life, right? Like if my car breaks down, I don't need to necessarily rely on my neighbor to take me to work. I can just call an Uber, right? Something like that. I can use money to get stuff done. Education, which is a resource that allows us to fit into what is often considered the professional groups or the elite spaces in society. We can say things in a in an articulate way. We can make sure we're speaking in a way that is germane to the topic at hand, and use those kinds of words to make people go, "Oh wow, they seem smart." It's a resource we can draw upon when you have it. The other one is occupational prestige, which is you have the kind of job which just kind of almost as table stakes earns you respect when you walk into a room. You say, "This is the kind of thing I do," and people say, "Oh wow, you are important. We can give you some deference." Different kinds of resources. So we measure those things and create composites of those things, like kind of summations of those three things to create this measure we call social class. Um, it can include a lot of other things too, but empirically, that's kind of how we measure it. Other folks do measure. I don't tend to, just as full disclosure, people's subjective perceptions of social class. So I have it grayed out here. It is absolutely a thing. Subjective social class is like your perception of what class you're in. One of the reasons I just don't measure it is there's also a lot of good data that people are really bad judges of that. I think that's one of the most recent studies I saw said 60% of people put themselves in the wrong class. And part of the reason why is in the United States, at least, everybody says, I came up middle class, right? Whether that's true or not, it's what we all tend to believe about our own upbringings. Not everybody, but it's common, right? And that might not be compared to reality favorably. How I got interested in this, just to get a quick background in it, was I was a PhD student, and I was a public school kid. And my first real experience in a private school was during my PhD. I got accepted to go to Cornell, and I was real excited about it. And I realized everybody was studying these organizations where people dress like kind of how I'm dressed right now, but even more fancy, frankly, to go to work. Like I've been working with doing this research in consulting firms or in these, banks or high accountancy or these other kinds of areas which are super important to study. Um, and I was having a hard time accessing those organizations to do my research, full transparency. I was having a hard time getting those companies to let me come in and do research. I had met somebody who was the CEO of a company out in Michigan that made what you're looking at right now. They made flip top trash cans. Matter of fact, if you have a flip top trash can, is probably made by this company. And they employed thousands of people. And they was like, yeah, why don't you come out and do some research? And so I did one of those things you can only do when you're very, very young, which is I went and interviewed like 70 people in 5 days across all three shifts and, was up all night doing, all hours of stuff, interviewing people, trying to get my sense around what this company's about. And one of the questions I was asking all of them was, do you think that your work is meaningful? One of the things I wanted to get is in terms of how you view your job. And kind of what I was expecting going in was the folks who dress like, this to go to work would say, of course, my job is very meaningful. And true enough, that is what they said. Most of them said, yeah, I mean, I'm out there increasing recycling and beautifying the planet and making, bringing things full circle to being able to be reusable and all this kind of stuff that we need to go out. I'm changing the planet in that way. And it's awesome. And, they're right. And I was kind of expecting after interviewing all of them first to go down to the manufacturing floors and have people saying, not really, because I'm really just working a plastic injection mold that makes these little pieces that go into this thing. And it was probably my own naivete that basically every single person I interviewed said, yeah, my job is very meaningful. Even the folks that are working down there in the manufacturing plants, but they said it for a very different reason. When I said, why do you think it's meaningful? All of them said, because if I didn't show up tomorrow, the person I work with would miss me. So it's a very different way of thinking about what makes your job meaningful, like meaningful out there in the grand scheme of things versus meaningful to the people around me. And I became very interested in that idea. And my next research study was done with a company that is a big nationwide landscaping firm. And in the landscaping firm, I kind of already had my bearings a little bit around the meaningfulness work part. But this company was doing something very interesting that I wanted to kind of get a better sense of. They started this program. This is an industry that has very high levels of turnover, incredibly high. I think the annualized turnover is like 130% a year. It's very difficult work to keep people in. And this company tried everything. They tried paying a couple, extra bucks per hour. Didn't seem to make a difference to turnover. They tried giving everybody a hat and a backpack and a t-shirt and swag, basically. And they found out, so, okay, swag doesn't do anything. Let's improve morale. Let's have a pizza party. Pizza party doesn't do anything. They started this program, though, called the Know Your Story program, which is right when somebody joins the organization, the crew essentially gets to know them. And they say, tell us about yourself. Where are you from? Do you have family? What do you like to do? We have other people who like to do that too. That's really cool. Their supervisor would also get their cell phone number. And at the end of the day, text them and say, how's your first day? And do you need a ride? We can come pick you up tomorrow. And what they ended up finding was by getting to know these people's story, making them feel connected to the people around them, their turnover rates went like this. This is an actual picture of their turnover rate. Went from 130% down to 50%, which still is very high, although it's kind of industry leading in this industry, right? But so it turns out the money and the swag didn't do anything, but feeling like you're connected to people around you really did. And this made me start thinking, I think management science may not have a great understanding of a huge population of workers in this country. And so I started kind of going farther down that rabbit hole. And most of the research that existed that I found can be summed up kind of like this. People who grow up in situations like this, where there might be many fewer resources, right? You just have access to less stuff. Um, Going to schools that are kind of like this, where you're treated more as someone to be controlled than encouraging expression, right? Where there's people go through the metal detector, and I went to one of these schools myself when I was young, which is like my parents were forever getting called to pick me up because they're like, Sean will not just sit still and stop talking. Um, but the orientation of the school I went to was sit still in your desk and shush, right? It's a controlled kind of orientation. When you grow up in neighborhoods like this, where you have like basically one resource and the entire neighborhood can play with that resource, you learn very different lessons about the world than when you grow up in settings like over here on the right, over here where people might hold as this ideal. I've made it. I'm successful, so I want everybody to be far away from me. I'm going to put up a wall with a gate, so I'm farther away from the people near me. Right? I was one of these people during the pandemic. I'll fully admit, and I'm not proud of it, but I didn't even know my neighbors till the pandemic hit. We were all walking around our neighborhood, right? So it was like because I lived on a bigger property, they were farther away from me. Kids who grow up in those kind of settings learn different lessons. Kids who go to schools where the orientation is not really control, the orientation is around expression. Students might ask these very young children, what do you think Aristotle meant when they said blah blah blah? And it's like, in my mind, I'm like, they don't know. Why are you asking them? Because that's kind of how the schooling that I went to, right? Um, that tells them, hey, your opinion's really important. This adult is asking my opinion on what this person is trying to say and mean, right? Which is pretty different. When people grow up in situations where their activities are more like this, and granted, I chose the farthest, most shishi activities you can do. This is a very expensive activity, right? This kind of dressage thing. But think about it. There's lots of activities that are like that, where you probably have an individual coach. It's very equipment intensive. Your parents have to take you there a lot and invest a lot in you getting good at that thing. And it's an individual level sport too. It's not the whole neighborhood can play. We learn very different lessons about the world and our place in it when these are the situations we come up in. And prior research in sociology and social psychology had kind of distilled those things to suggest it can sort of differ along these dimensions. People who grow up in these lower resourced areas develop a much stronger sense of community and a focus on the people around them because it's a very important currency, whether you have good connections in your community. Go back to that example of my car breaking down. If my car breaks down and I don't have the money for an Uber, I better have really good relationships with my neighbors because they're going to have to take me to work. Or if I have a kid who's sick and I can't hire a babysitter, I better make sure my neighbor, the person who lives down the block, can watch my kids today. Otherwise, I can't even go to work. So those connections in your community are actually more important than the job because you can't have the job unless you have those things already unlocked, right? It encourages pro-sociology, that is trying to do more pro-social things with people around you because that's the currency of building that community. That'll help you help them out so that when you're in trouble, they help you out and so on and so forth. There's some really good data by a colleague of mine that shows people who grow up in these environments actually have higher empathic accuracy. That is one of the dimensions of emotional intelligence, being able to be aware of the emotions in the setting that you're in. Because again, I have to know, how's my community doing, right? To be able to keep these relationships. Also a lot of toughness, kind of like don't complain. We don't want to complain about stuff. Don't complain about your problems. Everybody's got problems, right? It orients these kinds of ways of being, the context itself. On the flip side, growing up in more resourced places fosters what we call a sense of independence, which is more of a self and individual focus. How do things affect me? And it's not necessarily a nefarious or bad thing. It's just, I don't really have to think about relying on other people. I can call that Uber, right? My parent can call a babysitter or a nanny or somebody to come watch me. Like resources for my activities get directed right to me. Teachers are always asking me my opinion, so my opinion must matter and must be very important. It just has this sense of I am a very important central person in this zone, right? A sense of individuality certainly goes along with that. Idiosyncratic, which is like being free to express yourself because there aren't really many consequences for expressing yourself, right? It's we can talk about our problems and kind of laugh at them, whereas in a different setting, our problems are real problems. Right. So it generates these like felt differences there. And so I took a lot of that I was able to read and learn and said, how does this play out at work and in the management realm? The thing that kind of stuck in my craw, though, that I wasn't super comfortable with in a lot of this was there was a perspective by a famous sociologist, Bourdieu, who has done fantastic work, that said the habitus, which is basically the context you grow up in, imprints you in some way. It leaves these lasting marks that you carry with you through your life. And the management research early on in social class kind of ran with that story, including myself, about when you have these experiences when you're young, it's imprinted on you and you carry it all the way through your life. And to that end, my first management study in this area was looking at a bunch of folks in the U.S. Army. God bless the U.S. Army; they keep incredible records. So I went to West Point Military Academy and asked some of the folks there, "Do you want to do a study together?" And the answer was, "Sure, let's work on it." And so we had all these college applications from people who ended up going to West Point, and they come from a very socioeconomically diverse background. And the Army keeps all of these things. And one of the things that they have to report when they apply is how much money do your parents make, because that's one of the ways we decide who gets scholarships and merit help and so on and so forth, right? So they keep that. So we had a good measure of their parental income while they were growing up, pre-college. And then we sent surveys out to these actively deployed soldiers and asked them to fill out a survey, and then also to ask all the people in the battalions that they were leading to also fill out a survey evaluating them. And we got a pretty good response rate on it. And what we ended up finding was the people who came from households with higher levels of income, when they were adults and deployed actively as soldiers, they expressed higher levels of narcissism, self-rated narcissism. The questions weren't like, "Do you think you're a narcissist?" Right? They're more indirect than that. It was like people rating more strongly agree to questions like, people frequently compare me to famous people. I am usually the life of the party. Things are boring when I am not there. Things like that. So they tended to answer more strongly yes on those kinds of questions. And what that led to was less engagement as rated by their followers in these three buckets of leadership behaviors. And we won't go super into that detailed thing. There's three major buckets of leadership behaviors that we consider to be essential to do, which is building good relationships, clearly structuring the work, and creating the context for good communication. Their followers perceived them being worse at that, right? As not doing those kinds of behaviors. And that led to some outcomes that weren't as good in those groups, right? So we were like, wow, that's wild, right? People from low social class backgrounds might actually display less narcissistic tendencies when they're in a leadership position, as found in this group of soldiers, at least. So that imprinting thing also turned up a lot of that imprinting perspective, which again, I just showed you a study I did in the imprinting thing, how you were brought up still affects you today, led to a lot of different findings. Some people have argued, they have a higher fear of authority because authority has more power, can cause more problems for you if you rock the boat, more impulsive behavior. There's been also, these are stereotypes down here that people have surveyed. What do you think about people from lower class backgrounds? And a lot of the evidence suggests people assume them to be a little bit less intelligent, a little bit less competent, and a bunch of other things that I was deeply uncomfortable with. Because again, I didn't come from poverty, but I came from a much more modest background than a lot of the folks I did my grad school work with. And I was like, that's not my experience. That's not what I perceived at all. I understand that might be the bias out there, but I don't think that's correct. So I started thinking about what happens when people transition, when they move from a lower social class to a higher class. How do they change? How does that journey shape them? Right. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests we do change. As your context changes, you tend to change. We don't think about it a lot, but the companies we work in change us. They socialize us. When you're there for 10 years, you leave that 10 years a different person. Your school socializes you. These are big institutions and shapes some of the way that you think and act and navigate and all this kind of stuff. We change all the time, right? When our context changes. And some of the evidence out there from economics suggests social class changes happen too. And when they do, people change in response. Like moving up from a less, resource-rich position to a more resource-rich position relates to better health outcomes and better educational outcomes, better physiological and psychological outcomes by just moving up in context. It turns out a good colleague of mine who's at Northwestern, a brilliant researcher, Nicole Stevens, had found these first-gen students at her school, when they're taught how to act in this more elite space where she teaches, when they go through essentially a little socialization and training session of here's the rules here, they perform just as well as everybody else. They just didn't know the rules, right? So once they learn that context, they can change and adapt and succeed there. There's cool things about how wealth managers for the uber wealthy have to learn to adapt their norms and change their cultural nuances and frameworks and cultural touchstones to relate to this other uber wealthy group, and they can learn to do it. So the evidence suggests that people can learn. I'm not going to walk us through this model. This is a theory that I wrote, and it's one of these great things that happens in academia when you have a really good idea, and then through the review process, they make you turn it into a Frankenstein monster. The overall good idea, because this is a Frankenstein monster model, I'm fully aware, right? But I'll tell you this. The idea that I had was this, basically this here. The distance between where you started, your class origin, and where you've ended up, your class destination, informs and gives you what we call a cultural toolkit. That is, different class positions can be thought of as essentially different cultures with different ways of being, different norms, different behavioral tendencies, so on and so forth, lenses to view the world through. And if you've been in a lot of those, you essentially learn to adapt in a lot of these different environments and become effectively multicultural. And then when you have that skill set, it can be very valuable to organizations in a lot of different ways. So we took that idea and ran with it. And this is unpublished data because there's some problems with the data. It's a very complicated graph, but I'll show it to you and walk you through it just so we know what we're talking about. This is what's called a response surface analysis. This early study looked at how much money did your parents make? What was the income of your origin? And this is in hundreds of thousands, so 100, 200, 300,000, and so forth. And then how much do you make now in terms of 100, 200, 300, $400,000, right? CQ is your level of cultural intelligence. Right? How culturally intelligent do you seem to be? And that's, by the way, the problem with this data is that it's self-rated. That's why one of the reasons it's unpublished. So put that out there as a disclaimer. This line down here is called the line of congruence. It's where there's no movement. All right. It's where someone who came from a household of 100 is making about 100 themselves. A person who came from a household of 200 is making about 200 themselves, right? There's not been a lot of class movement in their life. What's interesting is along that line of congruence where there's no movement, these are all the lowest points of cultural intelligence. Meanwhile, a person who started off at a low position, but now is at a high position along this line of incongruence, that's the highest point. The people who've had the most movement from low to high espouse the highest levels of cultural intelligence. And on the flip side, people who started off high but are now low, that's right here. That's the second highest point. In other words, it was suggestive to us we might be onto something, that movement might lead to this cultural intelligence thing. So we started getting kind of excited by that and looking into some more studies around that. So my buddy Stefan Cote, who did that empathic accuracy research about social class, he and I went and did a whole bunch of stuff, nationally representative samples, thousands and thousands of people looking at levels of entitlement. Part of the reason we looked at it was it's related to narcissism, but it's also what I hear about in the business school all the time. We have so many recruiters and corporate audiences that are like, I feel like the next generation is just so entitled. So we're like, well, let's explore if that's true, right? So what we ended up finding is this. These are all interaction models, and I'll walk us through it really quickly. This highest point in all of these graphs, regardless of how you're measuring social class, those highest points are all the people who were born into privilege and have remained in a privileged position. Basically, if you have been upwardly mobile, you don't feel the same level of entitlement. If you've been downwardly mobile, you don't feel the same level of entitlement. If you've always been low, you do not feel that same level of entitlement. The highest levels of entitlement tend to be espoused by people who were born high and have remained high, which is interesting from a management perspective because it's also kind of would suggest, and this is me extrapolating out, the problem isn't actually that the next generation is entitled. The problem is we're probably hiring the people who are the most likely to be that thing. By looking at this track record of, did you come from the best school? Did you go to the best school before that? Did you have internships at the very best places? Did you have if you've come from all of this the whole time, we might unintentionally be bringing in this other thing that we say we don't like. Okay. From there, we started looking at other stuff, and I started kind of going, well, what are some other potential benefits of these folks who've been upwardly mobile or from different class trajectories? And one of the things I ended up finding in my next big study, this was in a high technology firm, was one of the theories that had existed previously is people from low social class positions would have less what we call self-efficacy or confidence in themselves. And again, that didn't ring true for me. So I was like, well, let's just see if that's accurate. And what we ended up finding was upward mobility among people was strongly and positively related to their feelings of self-efficacy. As a matter of fact, their confidence in themselves was just as high as the people who'd always been in privileged positions. And that led them to engage in this really beneficial team behavior we call employee voice, which is being willing to speak up with ideas and point out problems and contribute. The problem was upward mobility was negatively related to this thing that we call managerial voice solicitation, which is your boss's likelihood of asking you for input. Meaning, I will speak up. I'll do the hard stuff. I'll speak up and give my ideas, but nobody's really asking my ideas or wanting to hear me. Right? And that has a negative impact on a person's overall voice. So this is obviously concerning. This is all within one company, right? Of people who are basically at the same level, doing the same kinds of work. We're seeing this discrepancy in who we're going to for input. Right? So look, here's where we are right now. Social class transitioners. There's evidence they have really good things that we probably want. They might be less narcissistic leaders. They seem to be less entitled. They might have strong beliefs in their own efficacy, high levels of cultural intelligence. I also have done a couple of reviews on this subject and I've combed the literature. I can find no meaningful performance differences once people are in the same job based on their social class background. I can find none. At least, again, I'm still looking, but I've found none so far and still cannot. So even though they basically have all these things we want and there doesn't seem to be a performance difference, their professional journey is still really rough. People who come from lower class backgrounds are less likely to get invited for job interviews at prestigious firms. One of the reasons that recruiters at prestigious firms often give is, I don't know if they seem like a cultural fit, even though they've achieved the same things as other people in their applicant file, right? Or they're less likely to be evaluated positively when they do get the job interview. Oftentimes, one of the things that, that the research has shown is people see the way that they act and comport themselves and go, I don't know if they have the agency and they're not a go-getter, a self-starter like we want, even though the evidence would suggest they're very much a self-starter. They came from very little to get to that point, right? But something about them, it doesn't feel like what I'm used to. There's actually a class pay gap that's the same size as the gender pay gap. That is, for the same occupation, a person from a lower class background tends to get paid about 10% less than a person from a high class background for the same job. There also tends to be less leadership emergence despite no performance differences. People just go, I don't know, don't they just seem awesome? They speak in those urbane ways and they're able to do these things that just seem so great. Let's make sure they're the leader of the group, right? Despite no underlying performance difference. And the people who come from, who are more, socially mobile, who come from lower class backgrounds, feel more experiences of awkwardness or isolation. Part of the reason why is in the elite spaces, they're sort of like, I don't know if I totally fit here. But I also don't fit where I came from either, because I'm not in that context anymore either. I could feel very lonely, right? So I want to walk us through really quickly and just, a couple minutes, some of the recent studies. This is unpublished studies because they're still ongoing. Data collection is still ongoing on these, but I'm kind of continuing this trajectory of research looking at social class in terms of innovative performance. What happens with social class in teams? Does social class affect how people relate to their jobs, how they feel about the jobs that they have when they're there? So I'll walk us through those really quickly. They seem to me like important next questions to figure out. There's all these benefits for upward transitioners. Are there more than what I've already found? Are there other things that we would want in our organizations? So for the social class and innovation one, innovation refers to it not just coming up with cool ideas. That's creativity, and innovation involves that, but it's coming up with great ideas and the ability to implement them. So it's being able to make them happen, right? That's the innovative process. So to study this, I got to work with this large textile and chemical firm here in the US that has a lot of R&D teams trying to make new breakthroughs in chemical processes and textile processes and so on and so forth. So we had 116 teams engaged in innovative work, and I surveyed them at 3 different points in time, separated by a month, looking at social class, team dynamics, and then I had their bosses rate all of the teams as to how much innovation is coming out of those teams, as well as a measure of what they call their stage gate processes, which is, are you meeting important milestones in your developmental process? So it's like, is your process good, and are you overall an innovative team? All right, so here's those things: measured transitions, innovation, stage gate processes. And we controlled for a lot of other stuff, race, gender, team size, things that are also important to control when you're looking at teams and also studies of class. In terms of, this is a correlation table, and in terms of what we found, it turned out the teams that had higher average transitions, that is, the people on the team had made farther transitions, right? When those teams had more class representation in terms of the distance traveled, those tended to be the more innovative teams in a direct correlation. They also tended to be making better progress towards their milestones than other teams did. Right? And then we said, okay, these are correlations. We got to actually control for all these other things though too, because there's a lot of correlations down here. You want to make sure you're keeping those effects constant. So we ran the regressions, and what we ended up finding was, even controlling for gender diversity on a team, racial diversity on a team, or team size, that important relationship remained. The teams where the people have seemed to have traveled more distance were rated by their bosses as producing more innovative things, which was very interesting, right? We still have to write this up and do some follow-ups and replications on it, but very intriguing. Part of this makes sense when you think about the multicultural nature of something. When you're multicultural, you have different touchstones and reference points and ideas and stuff that you can bring in to the innovative process. And the community focus, presumably, that can be instilled by these lower social class background experiences also might make you better at implementation. You're better able to work with people to get stuff done.
Yep, right.
So Sean, a question that came in the chat is,
Awesome.
has your research shown any insights on immigrants? Further explaining, educated immigrants can often come from upper class backgrounds in their native country, but usually have an uphill journey in their U.S. careers.
Yeah.
End question.
So that is a unbelievably interesting and important question. And the answer is going to be extremely disappointing because my answer is going to be no thus far. I will say this though, I'm going to add a page here because I want to draw something real quick. Here we go. There we go. Add page. I want to draw something just to be able to illustrate it. So the research that I've done absolutely has looked at immigration research to try to understand this. Because again, if we're thinking multiculturally, immigrant populations have a very clearly multicultural experience. And so theoretically, what I'm finding is very similar to the research from both immigrant research as well as expat employee research, which is, to your point, yes, there can be a lot of the similar effects I'm finding are also found there. But what they would argue is also the mode of acculturation matters, the mode of socializing. There are, and this I don't know this because this is a social class and management's a fairly new area. So there's a lot of questions we haven't asked. But my gut would tell me, and this is gut speaking, it would be extremely similar. And one way they look at immigrants in terms of acculturation is there are some folks who are like, I'm going to only maintain my familiar culture from my home country, even though I'm in this new place. And they end up not socializing to the new culture very much. There's another group that is like, I'm going to basically forget the place that I came from and just fully lean into this new one, right? And they socialize an absolute ton. Then there's people who kind of do both. There's people who are sort of in the middle, who kind of say, I'm going to keep a lot of these important cultural touchstones of where I'm from and adapt in these important and probably beneficial for me in some ways manners, right? There are folks who do that. There is evidence that the same kind of dynamic happens in the social class world. That is one of the reasons. So an example would be this. A colleague who was at Yale recently moved to Northwestern, did some great research that showed people are actually able to discern your social class with fairly decent accuracy, not perfect, but decent accuracy, just by the way that you look, sound, and talk. And one of the ways that happens is because a lot of people do choose to keep important elements of where they come from with them when they move into these new spaces, right? So for me, one of the ways that I did that was the way that I speak, so that personally, so like just to give an example, I had gotten some comments when I first started teaching. I was at Cornell, I taught some classes, and somebody wrote, Professor Martin's laid back way of speaking undermines his credibility, and I think he should invest in some diction lessons. Was one of the comments that I got as a course evaluation. Yeah, we professors get great feedback, right? We got one of those things. Most of it is good, but you always get a few of those. So you get that. And I thought about it for a while. I was like, should I try to speak more? Should I try to speak differently? Should I try to alter my manner of speaking? You could probably tell by the way that I talk, I'm not from Virginia, I'm from out West, right? So should I try to moderate my accent a little bit? And I was like, no, because it's who I am and I'm proud of where I came from. I proudly wear my, I was just talking to Said about this. I proudly wear and keep my Wu-Tang Clan paraphernalia all around me. Why? Because these are cultural touchstones of how I came up and where I'm from, right? And the stuff that was important to me back then. So there's ways people kind of can pick this up on you, which is similar to the immigrant experience, very much so, right? And I don't think any of it's bad or wrong. I think the challenge is society has a lot of what we call social constructions around those cultural touchstones that we carry with us, right? And to the extent that people might believe some of those stereotypes I was showing you earlier around being less competent, less intelligent, when they perceive them, they're more likely to apply those biases, which I think can be the same across, cultural transitioners of all kinds. Like one of the things I always hear in my classes, which is so interesting, is we have a very multicultural classroom here at the Darden School. We have a huge international population. Every once in a while, when we talk about these topics, someone will speak up and say, what's so funny is I actually am a very different personality when I have to speak English. And it's frustrating. Like when I get to speak my native language, people think I'm very funny. People think that all these different associations with me, but I don't perceive that any of you think that I'm that, right? And then we have to sit with that for a bit and go, well, are we maybe importing some socially constructed knowledge that isn't true, right? With the way this person's being received. So I think there's a lot of parallels there. It's a really good question. Oh, sorry, you're on mute, sir.
Yes, I appreciate you catching that. I know we talked about Q&A, and so we're just going to keep running. We're just going to keep running as it goes. Question,
Yeah.
colleague from mine. with your knowledge, is there anything actionable we can do to support our professional bros, wow, from lower class backgrounds? They made a note. I'm
Yeah.
the co-chair of the DEI committee for my national fraternity, which is a professional fraternity for chemists. Also, would you be willing to give a presentation similar to this, our committee sometime? No committal answer necessary. I'd love to have the talk to the committee anyway.
Well, hey, look, so the answer to the second question is yeah, of course. Like I study this stuff because I'm passionate about it, right? And I very much fundamentally believe in having the kind of society and being the kind of place where anybody who works hard is able to be upwardly mobile and be able to succeed there. A lot of the evidence we have suggests a big filtering thing happens for the people who are upwardly mobile, such that the most prestigious places that are the places that can also be gateways to ongoing mobility often select on the folks who come from this background of eliteness, even when even they're choosing between two people who've reached the same destination. So, in other geek out for 2 seconds, give an example, just to internalize it so it's real clear. Imagine you had two people graduating with MBAs from the Darden School, both of them had a 4.0. Prestigious institutions tend to look at those folks and say, well, I can't see any variance to make my choice on them. They both have achieved the same thing. So what am I going to do? I'm going to back up a little bit and go, well, one of them went to, you know, Princeton. One of them went to New Mexico State, great school, but it doesn't have the same brand cachet, right, as like a Princeton. So I'm going to choose the one that went to Princeton because they have the track record of eliteness. What that does unintentionally is it filters out the people who've been upwardly mobile. This person who came through a more modest route has achieved the same thing as the person who went to that other spot. We tend to filter them out. And so what I would say is I want to be the kind of place where we're encouraging the heck out of this upward path for folks, right? So yes, I'll speak to anybody, but also B, related to your question of what can you do, I think one of which is I do think we need to start having a weaker association that brand status equals quality. And when we start looking at how we filter through, how we make selections around who to hire and who to promote and whose voices to hear, we start basing it on potentially some more objective data around performance. There's a consulting firm, it's not academic data, that ended up finding once people are in the organization, where you went to school makes no difference in your performance in the firm. Once you're in, it makes a big difference in whether you get in. But once you're in, it doesn't seem to have an effect. So we start letting go of this idea a little bit, right? Being able to say, if I want to be the kind of person that enables this upward path, I also need to be the kind of person that gives folks, that provides opportunities. Because for people to move up, it requires two things: incredibly hard work and someone willing to take a shot on them. My perception, this is outside the data, my perception is there's a lot of people out there who are working real hard. There's questions about how many shots they're getting based on what we're looking for and how we're evaluating. So in terms of how we could support, I would start to say, let's focus on how we can allocate our opportunities. So that would be my 2 cents.
Another question came in, and what role do parental attitudes and engagement with their young child influence the child's view of themselves relative to their social class as they grow up, i.e., parents can communicate expectations that differ from their class?
Yeah. So this person is literally speaking my nightmares into existence. And I mean that in a good way. So again, the research is very early on a lot of this stuff. And so there is research on social class and child development. Um, and so it's really compelling and fascinating. Things like, children from wealthier households are less likely to share their toys in daycare centers was like a big, the study that I saw done. So, so it's this stuff around self-focus starts very early. And I live in terror of this because, I'm very fortunate. I'm teaching this nice business school. Like I'm in a higher class position myself. And I want to try to make sure that my kids don't grow up with this being the expectation that they're the center of the universe. So I don't have like a science-backed answer for you, but what I'm at least hanging personally my hat on is the mechanisms that seem to explain the self-focus that comes out from being in a more privileged position seems to be the community focus thing and how interdependent you perceive yourself to be. And so if that's the mechanism, what I've been trying to do, at least for my part, and again, I'm not ever going to write a parenting book, right? I'm not that guy. So I always want to put out that disclaimer. I'm really trying to focus on the community side and saying, can we get my kids in a very diverse community being able to engage with people different from them. I'm actually choosing things like, can we do athletic activities that are team-based, not individual sports? Can we find service projects for you to get involved in? Can we emphasize, one of the phrases they've heard me say a lot is, listen, you're the center of my world, but you are not the center of the world, right? So I'm going to pour into you a ton, and I love you, but like the rest of the world does not feel that way. You have to earn this out there, right? And have these community connections with people because the community helps you out when you need it, and so on and so forth. So it's like being really trying to hit that community part to make people perspective take that it's not always about us. And oftentimes the best thing we can do is take care of those around us, and that is a pathway to being very influential, which is a leadership thing, accumulating influence. You do that by serving other people. So that's something from the parenting side. You like literally, I'm up too late at night thinking about this. Like, oh no, am I creating problems? So I think about it. Now, thankfully, my children are angels, but it's also like I do worry about the same thing.
John, we're not even done with the presentation, but we're just going to keep going with the questions because this is how you do it. So I'm going to combine these two questions, but I have to share their one remark. A former leadership class student of Mr. Dr. You hate titles, Sean.
I'm Sean, yeah. Right.
So lovely in your class again. Love the fact that we're able to do this. Any career advice for aspiring upward class movers? But the next question is, do gender differences exaggerate the challenge in the transition, as you talked about the class gap?
So great question. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. That's one of the answer is yes, not consistently. It seems to for some outcomes, less so for others, and we don't think we have a clear framework as to when it does and when it doesn't. It's one of the reasons we control for gender quite a bit. Like we know that these things are, intersecting in a lot of ways. Like social class does intersect with race and gender. Women are more likely to occupy lower social class positions than men are. So these things absolutely are interwoven. I don't think we've done a great job teasing apart what effects are what, but they absolutely play together. If I can give you a reference, it's available for free on Google Scholar. There's a great paper by a scholar named Lauren Rivera and her colleague Andros Tilsic. So she's from Northwestern, he's from University of Toronto, and they did a beautiful field experiment using actual resumes that they're fake resumes, but they sent these resumes out to real firms to figure out what kinds of responses are we going to get to people with these different profiles who've achieved the exact same things, but one of them, it's pretty obvious, has been on the up and up. The other one has been in a privileged position. They not only found differences in terms of social class like we're talking about, but they did find an interaction where race on top of social class made an additional penalty. So I do think there absolutely are areas where it does matter. I don't think we know enough yet to be able to say systematically, here's how and for what outcomes. But the answer is yes. Your intuition's correct. It does seem to. And also, who are you? Send me an email. So a former student of mine, I can't wait. I would love to be able to reconnect. I would love to be able to talk to you again.
I can share their name with you if you'd like me to.
Yeah, send me an email and let me know. I'd love to be able to say hello again. That's so nice.
Their name is Lucas Yee.
Oh my gosh, so cool. No way. That's awesome. That's phenomenal. I'm so glad you're here, Lucas. Incredible. Dude, we gotta reconnect. We gotta get an email going. That's amazing. Thank you.
Next question. Oh wow. This one's a long one, but I really want you to touch on this question that just came in.
Sure.
A short question. Do you believe the church can help in the role of community?
Yes, I do. I think it could be one of many tools, though, right? One of the great benefits, if we take the religious aspect out of church and consider it and this is, I know that's hard for folks to do, but like churches are organizations. And one of the things I say is organizational behavior. And one of the things that was fantastic in eras when people used to belong to more faith-based organizations was they had more reasons to get together and mix with people from around their community. But the same kinds of things were also achieved through what used to be community groups like, I don't know, Elks Lodge, right? So things like that, these community organizations that we get together. In fact, if you're interested in such a topic, there's an author, he's a very famous sociologist named Robert Putnam, and he wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And it's how we all used to be, it was a standard thing for people to be part of community organizations. When he focused, the title of the book is on bowling leagues, and how people used to always go to bowling leagues. They'd mix with their community members and compete and be on different teams and meet a bunch of different people. And you had to have this, interactions with folks. There weren't quite as many divisions between folks there. And as those community organizations, and churches certainly one, kind of started to go away, we started having less connection socially to one another. And that can absolutely exacerbate some of these class differences, right? So I think to that point, I think, yes, an organization like a church can play a key role that way. But other ones can too, right? So I think a lot can. The more we can try to increase the touch points and the contact points between folks is very beneficial. It's a very astute question.
This one's a little bit of a long one. Can you speak to the impact that the dominant culture in the US, begin in parentheses, white, male, straight Americans, end parentheses, has on your research and findings?
Yeah.
Continuing with, that is what you are sharing is in relation to interaction with the dominant culture, which has particular challenges, stressors, etc. For everyone else who was not a part of the dominant culture, but must learn to function within it, continues to say that is people of color from high statuses may not experience the same outcomes, experiences, etc., due to their race, gender, orientation, etc.
Yeah, that's a fair question, and I'll say there's a few parts to that. So it's a very fair question, and absolutely critical for us to understand. So there's there's the theory of intersectionality, which people have heard quite a lot about in the news, and I think it's one of these things. Can these bases of diversity, these different areas where people can differ, sort of intersect and interact and become multiple compounding things? And so like can social class and race interact? I will say, at least in my research, we always control for race and gender. That means holding constant the effects of race and gender. What evidence do we see? And that's trying to isolate the effect of social class, even considering the effect of race and gender. And we still find these effects of social class independently. So I'd say in terms of dominant culture, we try as best we can methodologically to hold what race someone is from constant. So do we still see these kinds of effects regardless of what race one might be? That said, one of the difficulties around intersectionality is not conceptual, it's methodological for us. I don't know that we have we can try to do a lot of, for those who are my stats heads and my nerds, we can try to do a lot of moderation, interactions, and this kind of stuff to find stuff. Problem is you need massive sample sizes for that. And in organizations, that can be hard to find when you need large representations among multiple groups, among multiple social class stuff. So that's challenging. It's also not clear that that's the way to do intersectionality. We have to try to find a way to operationalize it better to address the exact kinds of questions that you are asking. Like not just do these dynamics play out across race, which again, from the methods we're using would suggest, yes, they do matter regardless of what race someone is in. These same kinds of patterns of dynamics happen. But to answer your more deeper question of, are they more exaggerated and more accentuated, or the repercussions of these behaviors interpreted differently? Do people experience very different outcomes because of them, and so on? And I don't, at least my knowledge to date is we don't have a great way of trying to do that. There's people who are doing qualitative research on it, and they're creating unbelievably interesting findings on the qualitative side, suggesting intersectionality in this way absolutely does matter. But I'm afraid I'm a quantitative researcher, and I don't have the quantitative. I don't know how we do that yet in the workplace, because that's where the domain of my research is focused. But gosh, I want to. I'm starting to think again. 2 seconds again for my stats heads. I think the way we're going to have to get at it is meta-analyses. Once more of these kinds of studies come out, we're going to start putting them all together and running large analyses on all of the participants who've been in all of these studies to try to get at it. I don't know that we have the database of studies to do it yet, but we should.
As a way to keep everyone involved, when you mentioned the Elks,
Yeah.
funny you should bring up the Elks. My husband is a very active member. The Elks help the community in many ways. Wanted to throw that in
Cool.
because they decided to throw it in. We have
Awesome.
more question.
Yeah.
Your theory focuses on social class transitions, but it focuses exclusively on upward mobility. If your theory is that such transitions impact the cultural toolkit that people are able to draw from in leadership positions, I wonder if you might refine your theory by looking at the relationship between downward mobility and leadership skills.
For sure.
This last comment, I'm just going to read it because they wanted me to share it. You'd likely need to identify leadership positions in low-paying jobs, nonprofit work, and the socioeconomic transitions of people in leadership roles.
For sure. Well, it's a fantastic question. It's one of the things we actually started looking at. Let me just go back to some of the other stuff that I showed. this Frankenstein monster that I was showing you earlier, one of the things that you can see is we are absolutely looking at transition direction. Are you moving up or down? And part of the reason why is from a theoretical standpoint, we do see some evidence of this in the findings that we have done so far. You're right. I care a lot about the upward mobility. It's a part of what I'm wanting to do is make sure more people can move up, but we do need to understand downward mobility. There is more reluctance to socialize and change on the way down than there is on the way up. And you actually, as a matter of fact, you see that here in this data that I showed you here. The strongest effect was for the people who've been moving up, and the effect was still there, but less strong for the people who've been moving down. Similarly, we're looking at what happens with downward mobility in this interaction study as well. Like this is people who've been stable high, but we don't see the same levels of entitlement to people who've been moving down. And so we are starting to look at that. And part of the reason there's less of a desire to socialize is it's just less comfortable. Moving down is a lot less desirable, right? So when you're moving from one culture to a culture that feels less desirable, that is when you're in a very privileged position, you're starting to move down to a place where there's far less resources and you're far more constrained. The benefits you have is maybe still some social connections to people who aren't on the way down, who might have been in your prior networks. There's a strong motivation to still remain affiliated as much as you can. Culturally is an easier way to do it with the folks that were in the place you came from, which was higher, right? Because they can provide opportunities and provide these ways for you to maybe try to bounce back. So we do need more data on it. You're absolutely right on that. But theoretically, what it would suggest is downward mobility is less comfortable, so people are way less likely to want to acclimate, right, to that environment. They're more likely to say, "I don't want this anymore. How do I get back up?" Whether they're successful or not is a different question. But in terms of how they socialize on the way down, maybe less so. Yeah, it's a very good point. It's a good question.
And so this was a question that was asked prior to the presentation, and I want to make sure that we get this in the recording.
Sure.
How does first generation college students comes into play when it comes to business school or other advanced degree programs? I feel like that's an admissions questions, but if you're open to it.
Well, I mean, it's funny. A lot in social psychology, one of the ways they look at these similar kinds of questions is looking at first gen status as a way to try to operationalize a social class background. It's not exactly the same thing, but it certainly correlates, it certainly overlaps with social class. I mean, you actually, and the reason it's not exactly the same thing is you can have people whose parents might not have gotten a college education, but they're perfectly affluent and have like fine jobs and jobs that would still make people say, "Oh wow, you started your own company and you run this kind of thing," or you do make a lot of money, and so you're able to make all of your ends meet. And so that first gen student is still first gen, but it'd be different than someone who would be from a person who comes from a lower resource background, who's doesn't have parents with the same occupational prestige and doesn't have the education. So they're overlapping because that education dimension they have they intersect, but they're not quite exactly the same thing. And I would again direct you to the work of a scholar named Nicole Stevens. Same thing. If you go to scholar.google.com, Google Scholar makes so many of our papers freely available. So again, her name is Nicole Stevens, and she's from Northwestern. She's done a lot of great research on this, on what universities can try to do, and it does involve teaching and training and outreach and getting people to up to speed on what are called the cultural rules of this new, more elite environment. Because again, her findings suggest when people do understand the rules, they're perfectly good at playing the game, right? They're absolutely able to do it. So a lot of folks show up and they're like, "I don't know the rules of how to get along this way." Like a personal example, when I first went to college, I had no idea that all of my classmates were meeting with the professors in office hours and talking to them and getting to know them. Like, are you? That was mind blowing to me, right? But that was part of the game, right? That folks play. When I first started teaching, the number of people who were like, I just want to come by your office hours to meet you." I was like, "Oh, okay, but that's surprising. Like, why do you want to meet me?" Right? It just wasn't culturally something that I was used to. And I'm like, happy to do it, but I didn't know. Right. So I do think getting people up to speed on those kinds of norms and rules and practices can be a big help. But I do think also, Said, you're right in terms of what we're looking for in terms of experiences. How to select on that that's very much out of my wheelhouse. But there are things we can do for the folks that are here, I think, to get the first gen folks up to speed, so they don't have the higher attrition rate that we currently see in most universities, that those folks tend to have a higher attrition rate. We can do more for that.
My first gen experience in grad school was apparently you're supposed to skim the readings, not read it
Yeah, right?
verbatim. I didn't realize that.
Totally. Wait, you guys don't actually read every word, dude? And then when someone's trying to teach me to take notes, my early notes, my wife cracks up about this because like when we were in our PhD program, she was like, "You might as well just not underline because you're underlining every single word, like line of these articles," which is just true. It was like I didn't know what to do. I'm taking notes, right? So, anyways, you learn the rules. So yeah, it's same, absolutely.
And then last one, I don't know how to phrase it better than, is there a quantifiable difference in work ethic between the different socioeconomic classes?
So not that I know of. I mean, we don't. It depends what you also mean by like
Quantifiable.
yeah, exactly. It depends what you mean by quantifiable, and it depends what you mean by like work ethic. But I can say not that I know of. Doesn't mean that there's some study out there. There's so many studies of all kinds of different topics out there, but I have not seen one. And what I have seen is no performance differences, which would suggest, in terms of the ability to get things done, regardless of work style and work ethic, at least for people when they're in the organization, right? Which is where I tend to intersect with them and study them. Doesn't seem to be that I know of, right? So it's an indirect indicator, but I don't know of the study that looks at that. Yeah.
Sean, thank you so much for your time, your knowledge, your experiences, and you are definitely man of the people, throwing out so many names from Laura Rivera, Robert Putton, Nicole Stevens. I love the fact that you give credit to so many other folks as it relates to your research, enabling folks to generate a source of community. It speaks a lot to your research. It speaks a lot to you practice what you preach in all avenues of your life. We've got a couple more seconds. Is there anything you want to sign off with?
Yeah, I want to show you one other thing, just because I'm the business school nerd. So I just measured a bunch of my students on like the evidence of like how do you feel about your job and how much do you appreciate your job. And this is another one of those things questioning like why are we hiring the way that we do. And this gets back to some of this selection stuff. One of the things I ended up finding is an executive MBA sample. I measured people's social class origin when they came in on a pre-course survey, as well as do they feel like they're overqualified for their job. So it relates to this like independent focus and inflated sense of entitlement, narcissism, and so on. How does that relate to commitment? And it's a smaller sample size. We're replicating it right now. One of the things we find is people from higher class backgrounds are more likely to say that they are overqualified for their job, which in turn makes them espouse less commitment, less job satisfaction, higher intentions to quit. So my next question on that was I was saying, well, does that matter? Does it matter how prestigious the job is? So I did a moderated model to look at that. And the answer is, yeah, it does. What ends up happening is when a job is not prestigious at all, there's no difference between low class and high class in terms of perceived overqualification because all of them think they're the low overqualified, the low prestige places. But when places become extremely prestigious, the folks from lower class backgrounds do not see themselves as overqualified anymore. And the folks from higher class backgrounds say, yeah, I'm still overqualified, even though it's a prestigious place. So I'm saying the reason I wanted to hit that as one of my last questions is when we start thinking about how we allocate those opportunities, from one of those earlier questions, how do you allocate your opportunities? I think we should start asking ourselves as a business community, but even beyond that, just like as a culture, do we want to keep allocating the opportunities we have to give? Who gets hired, who gets promoted, but also whose voice do we seek out? Who do we bring with us to an important meeting? Who do we mentor? Who do we do these other things? We all have opportunities to potentially give to the people around us. We want to keep giving opportunities to people who've already had kind of a ton of them. And what this stuff would suggest is might not appreciate them as much. Or do we want to start giving to the people who are working really hard and really just need a shot? Right? It's because we're the kind of people who in this Zoom room, this Zoom room's full of the kind of people who can give somebody a shot. So, anyways, that's my 2-second passing thing to go with. But this has been so fun. Thank you for having me, everybody, and thanks for letting me, talk to you and kind of bumble around and all that kind of stuff. It's been a joy.
It's truly been a pleasure. Please be on the lookout for a survey letting us know how we can do this better for future virtual lecture series. Thank you so much for joining us. And if y'all would like to hear from somebody new that you don't believe many have heard from, please feel free to include that in the survey. We're always trying to find different topics for our UVA community to learn about. So thank you once again. We ran 2 minutes over, but it's been a joy. Have a great rest of y'all's day.
Thank you.